They didn't call her by her name, not once. Not when she was brought forward, not when her father spat on the dirt and said, "She's yours now," and not when the townsfolk laughed like it was some cruel game. They just said the heavy one, the girl with too much meat, the burden. Her name was Clara, and if anyone had asked, she would have told them she liked to sew, that she sang when no one was listening, and that she believed in stories where love didn't come with conditions. But the town of Elmsfield didn't believe in stories, just trade. And when her father's debt grew too big and his shame too loud, he offered her like cattle to the first man who'd take her without payment. That man was dressed in worn clothes and carried no weapon. His face was quiet, unreadable. A Lakota warrior with no tribe behind him. Just a satchel, a blanket over his shoulder, and eyes that didn't flinch when the crowd jeered. Clara didn't cry. Not when the rope was placed in her hand instead of his. Not when he turned without a word and started walking toward the horizon. Not even when her father muttered, "You were never a wife anyway." She just walked behind the stranger, her face burning, her heart louder than her footsteps. They reached the edge of town before she dared speak. "You don't have to take me," she whispered. "I'd understand." He stopped, turned, looked her in the eyes like no one had in years. "I don't take," he said, voice low but sure. "I choose." Then he pointed to the sky, where a hawk circled once before soaring east. "That's where I'm going. If you want, you can come too." Clara blinked. Was this another test? Another cruel joke? But there was no smile on his face, no mockery in his tone. Just invitation. Just calm. So she nodded. And they walked. The town disappeared behind them, swallowed by dust and distance. She didn't know his name, didn't know where they were headed. But for the first time in her life, the silence around her didn't feel like punishment. It felt like space. Space to breathe, space to begin. And though her hand still trembled from the shame of being given away, it rested a little easier in the crook of her arm, carrying something she hadn't touched in years. Hope. They reached a small ridge by sundown, where cedar trees leaned like sentinels against the pale sky. He built a fire without asking for help, then handed her a thick fur blanket and a strip of dried meat, nodding once as if to say, "Eat if you wish." Clara sat cross-legged, unsure if she should speak. But the silence wasn't harsh. It felt sacred, like words would disturb something older than either of them. He didn't treat her like a chore, didn't glance at her like a man forced to carry shame. He looked once at her hands, red from the cold, still trembling, and placed a flat stone near the fire, motioning for her to warm them. That was the first kindness. The second came when he finally spoke. "I'm called Thalo," he said, staring into the fire. "I left my people 2 winters ago. Some say I am ghost-walked. Some say I carry bad luck." Clara dared a glance. "And what do you say?" Thalo paused, then shrugged. "I say I'm still walking." She nodded slowly. That made sense to her. She too had been walking her whole life, only in circles, around judgment, around hunger, around the way people saw her body before they saw her soul. But tonight, none of that followed them here. The fire popped and cracked, and the stars came out like tiny bells in the sky. She told him her name. He repeated it softly, like he was tasting it. Clara. It was the first time in years it hadn't sounded like a punchline. She swallowed thickly and asked, "Why did you take me?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was different, quieter than before. "Because when they laughed, you didn't cry. And when they handed you off, you stood tall. That's not shame. That's strength." Her throat closed. No one had ever said that, not even in passing. She blinked fast, staring at the fire. When he rose and walked a little way into the woods, she watched him go, wondering if he would come back. But he did, carrying a pine branch covered in snow. He laid it beside her like a pillow, then settled down on the opposite side of the fire, arms crossed, eyes closed. No expectations, no weight, just peace. Clara curled into the blanket, her cheek against the pine, and for the first time since childhood, her body didn't feel like a burden. It felt like hers, warm, worthy, welcome. The next morning, Clara awoke to the scent of sweet smoke and the sound of a blade scraping wood. Thalo sat across from her, whittling a branch with quiet focus, a pot of water steaming gently beside him. No command to rise, no barked orders, just space to exist. Her stomach growled loud enough for them both to hear, but he didn't flinch or grin. He simply handed her a warmed strip of cornbread wrapped in a linen square, as if he'd known hunger was her shadow. As she ate, she watched him carve. "What are you making?" she asked, crumbs on her lips. He didn't look up. "A shape that tells the truth." That puzzled her, but she didn't press. Not yet. They rode most of the morning without speaking, the snow beneath the horses' hooves muffling time itself. Around midday, he slowed near a stream half covered in ice and dismounted. Clara hesitated. "Do you live here?" He shook his head. "Not live." "Stop." She slid down behind him, wincing as her boots hit the ground. He noticed, nodded toward a log, and she sat. That's when he placed the carving in her lap. It was a figure of a woman, round, sturdy, arms folded over her chest like armor. Not thin, not weak. And her face, though rough, was hers. Clara stared. "Why?" she whispered. Thalo sat beside her but kept his eyes forward. "So you remember?" "Remember what?" "That they gave you away," he said slowly. "But the earth never did. Look around, Clara. Nothing in nature begs to be small. Not the hills, not the rivers, not the bears. You were made for space." Tears rose, hot and unwelcome. She blinked them back. No one had ever spoken of her with reverence, not even herself. She clutched the carving tight, afraid it might vanish. "You believe all that?" He finally turned to her, eyes solemn. "I believe in what stands tall when others kneel." Her breath hitched. She looked away. The wind shifted, bringing the scent of pine and something more. Burning. Thalo stood sharply, nose flaring. "Someone's close." He moved fast, kicking snow over the fire and motioning for her to stay low. Clara's heart pounded as she crouched, the carving still pressed to her chest. From the trees, faint voices carried. Male, laughing, unkind. Bandits, or worse. She looked at Thalo, who had already drawn a blade from beneath his coat. Not flashy, not cruel, just ready. She realized then. He hadn't just taken her to save her from shame. He had been watching the woods all along. And now he was ready to fight for a woman no one else had ever fought for. The voices grew louder, slurred and jeering, as two figures emerged from the trees, one dragging a sack of something wet, the other chewing jerky with a pistol loose in his belt. Clara froze, her breath stuck between ribs. Thalo stayed low, eyes fixed, motioning with two fingers. "Stay down." The men hadn't seen them yet. "Ain't no one out here but ghosts and fools," one chuckled, kicking the snow. "Bet that big one ran off with the mule again." Thalo moved like breath, silent, precise, coiled muscle in motion. He slipped behind a birch, blending into bark and shadow. Clara wanted to call out, to warn him, to beg him to stay hidden, but she trusted him more than her own panic. The two strangers stopped just feet from where she crouched. One sniffed. "Smoke?" The other turned, right toward her. His eyes narrowed. "Well now." She stood, not brave, but unwilling to hide. The smaller man grinned wide, revealing rotted teeth. "Ain't that a prize? What you doing all out here, sweetheart? Snow ain't no place for—" His words stopped when Thalo appeared behind him and pressed the edge of his blade to the man's throat. "Walk away." His voice was low thunder. Clara had never seen anyone freeze that fast. The second man reached for his pistol, too slow. Thalo kicked his hand, the gun tumbling into snow. "Next time," he said, "reach for your life, not your weapon." The men scrambled, slipping, swearing, dragging each other away without even a threat thrown back. Clara stood, fists clenched, eyes wide. Thalo retrieved the gun, emptied it, and tossed the pieces into the stream. Then he turned to her, jaw tight. "They'll come back." Clara nodded. "Then we leave." "Not just leave," he said. "We move like ghosts." That night they rode through thickets, crossed creeks, followed owl calls instead of stars. Thalo barely spoke, but his hand hovered near her stirrup every time she swayed with exhaustion. He kept her safe, not with speeches, but with presence. When they finally stopped beneath a rocky overhang near dawn, she collapsed beside the fire he built without flint. Clara didn't ask how. She just stared at him across the flame. "You knew they'd come." "The land always speaks before men do," he said, "and it said danger was close." She exhaled. "And why? Why did you stay? You could have run." Thalo looked at her, long and steady. "Because the world's already run from you once. I don't intend to do it again." And for the first time in years, Clara didn't feel like something someone had to survive. She felt like something worth returning to. By the second week of travel, Clara's thighs were raw from riding, her hands blistered from gripping leather reins, and her heart confused by the quiet way Thalo existed near her, never invading, never retreating. He taught her to read river bends and bird patterns, showed her where snow hides thin ice, and how elk trails lead to shelter. But he never asked her story. Not once. And somehow, that made her want to tell it. They were camped under pine needles, the wind whispering through branches like lullabies. She watched his hands as he carved a strip of bark into something small and curved. "Do you know," she said softly, "my father used to count my meals by what the animals didn't eat." Thalo looked up. "He had hogs. I was fatter than them. So when food was scarce, I got what they left." She wasn't sure why she'd said it. Maybe because the firelight made her face feel hidden. Thalo didn't interrupt. "When he got sick of looking at me, he traded me to a miner who couldn't have children, but I wasn't quiet enough for them either." She smiled, bitter. "Said my voice scared the baby goats, so he tied me to a cart and left me in the snow." Her voice cracked. "You found me after that." Thalo placed the carved object gently into her hands. It was a bird, rough but graceful. "The desert wren," he said. "Smallest bird in the valley, but its cry stops eagles mid-flight." Clara blinked. "You carved this for me?" "No." His voice was firm. "I carved it of you." She turned it over in her hands, seeing herself for the first time not as a burden, but a creature capable of being heard. "Why don't you talk more?" she asked. "Because most people fill silence with lies or noise," he said. "You fill it with truth." The wind shifted, and so did something inside her. "Will they come looking for me?" she asked. "Your father?" "The miner." "If they do," Thalo said, "we'll make sure they find your absence harder than your presence ever was." That night, Clara didn't lie on the ground with her arms wrapped around herself. She lay beside the fire with Thalo a breath away, the desert wren tucked against her chest. She whispered, "Thank you," but he was already asleep, knife still resting in his hand, like he was guarding something sacred. And maybe he was. The days that followed weren't measured in miles or hunger anymore, but in glances. Clara noticed how Thalo always walked a step behind her when the trail narrowed, not out of dominance, but protection. How he placed her food closer to the fire so it stayed warm, and how he let her speak without ever needing to reply. They came upon an abandoned cabin nestled in a grove where the snow didn't reach the windows. The walls were cracked, but the roof held. Clara looked to Thalo. "Can we stay?" He only nodded. Inside, she swept dust from the floor with her shawl. He fixed the chimney. By dusk, they'd made it a home. That night, Clara woke to a sound outside, something low, growling. She reached for the fire poker, but Thalo was already at the door, bow in hand. 2 mountain dogs were prowling near the woodpile, eyes lit red by firelight. Thalo stepped forward without hesitation. "Shoo!" he growled, not in English but Lakota, and the animals froze. Clara stood behind him, heart hammering. One of the dogs lunged, but Thalo didn't flinch. He stepped forward again and whistled. The sound was sharp and wild, like a coyote's cry. The dogs turned and ran. Clara stared at him. "What was that?" He didn't look back. "Something my mother taught me. Fear's loud, authority's quiet." She wanted to touch his back, to ask if she could keep learning from him. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer, but the next morning, there was a thick fur pelt laid across her blanket. It hadn't been there before. She picked it up and found a tiny, woven strip inside with her name stitched in red thread. Clara. She ran out to the river where he was fishing. "You sewed this." He didn't turn. "The women in my family don't wait to be rescued. They sew, hunt, name things." She stood beside him, her voice lower. "Then let me learn. Let me help." He handed her the rod. Their fingers touched. He didn't pull away. By sunset, she'd caught a fish the size of her hand, and he said nothing, but she saw the flicker of pride in his eyes. That evening, she sat beside him on the cabin's wooden step, not quite touching, but close enough. For the first time, she realized she wasn't waiting to be taken anywhere. She was already home. And the silence between them didn't need filling. It needed keeping. Like a promise. Like a beginning. Spring cracked open the snow with a slow rhythm, and Clara watched the forest change day by day. The stream near the cabin began to run louder. Sap dripped from the trees. Birds that hadn't dared to sing in winter now returned, and in that music, Clara learned to breathe without fear. Thalo carved wooden figures by the fire, animals mostly, but one night she saw him shaping something different. A woman. Rounder than most, with a braid down her back. Clara said nothing, but when he left for the creek the next morning, she tucked the carving into her apron pocket like a secret prayer. That afternoon, the wind shifted. Clara stepped outside to gather kindling and spotted 3 riders down the ridge. Men. White men. Ranch hats low, horses pacing slow. She didn't wait to be brave. She ran to Thalo. "They're coming," she said. He looked up from the snare he was setting and stood without a word. They didn't hide. Instead, Thalo stood tall in front of the cabin, while Clara stayed just behind him, her hand clutching a kitchen knife. The men approached, and the tallest one grinned. "Ain't this something?" he drawled. "Fat girl from Cardin's farm and a half-breed playing house." Thalo didn't move. Clara's heart pounded in her ears. "My pa gave me to someone else," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't get to take me back." The man laughed. "Sweetheart, you were never meant to last this long." He reached for his saddlebag. Thalo's bow was already drawn. The man froze. "You'd shoot a white man?" he hissed. "Not if you leave," Thalo said, voice calm. If you stay, I don't miss." Something in the way, he stood, rooted like an old tree, shoulders still, made the others falter. One of the younger men pulled back on his reins. "Ain't worth it," he muttered. "Let's go." The leader glared at Clara. "You're nothing but shame, girl." She stepped beside Thalo. "And you'll die angry that no one wanted you." They left in a huff of dust. When they were gone, Clara sank to her knees. "I thought they'd take me," she whispered. Thalo crouched beside her. "They can't take what's already free." She looked up at him, tears streaming. "Am I free?" He nodded. "As long as you stay by choice." And for the first time, she realized she didn't need protection anymore. She needed to be seen. And she was. Thalo led her higher into the hills the next day, saying nothing until they reached a ridge where the wind danced through tall grass. Below them stretched the wide basin where the buffalo once roamed, now quiet, sacred. "This," he said softly, "was my mother's place. She brought me here before her last winter. Said the wind up here tells the truth." Clara sat beside him on the sun-warmed stone, letting silence wrap around them. "What does the truth sound like to you?" she asked. He paused. "That you're more than what was done to you. That you're not someone's punishment or their secret." Her breath hitched because no one had ever said it so plainly. "They said I was shameful to look at," she whispered. "That no man would want me unless he was broken too." Thalo didn't look away. "Then let them stay blind. You're a woman of strength, not apology." She touched his hand, the one calloused from work and gentle in silence. "Why do you live alone?" she asked. "Because I wanted to be loud in the ways that don't hurt," he answered. "To live without needing to prove anything." They sat that way until the sky blushed with dusk. On the way down, Clara stopped suddenly. "Thalo?" He turned. "If I asked you to keep me, not protect me, not save me, but keep me, would you?" He didn't smile, didn't speak right away. Then he reached into his shirt and pulled out a red cloth pouch, small and worn. From it, he took a thin ring carved of bone and pressed it into her palm. "This was my father's," he said. "I've never offered it before." Clara's fingers trembled. "Then I'd like to wear it, not as proof I'm yours, but that I chose you." As night fell, they walked back in silence, hand in hand. Inside the cabin, Clara lit the fire, and Thalo stood by the door, watching her move with quiet awe. There was no ceremony, no one to witness it but the stars and the wood smoke. But when she slid the ring onto her finger and turned to him, he said, "This home is yours now." And she replied, "Then let it be a home we build together, not one we hide inside." In that moment, she was no longer the girl discarded like a curse. She was a woman, seen by someone who knew the truth of her spirit and chose it. The days that followed were stitched with slow grace, meals cooked side by side, wood chopped in rhythm, laughter that started low but came easier each morning. Clara no longer flinched at her reflection or shrank when her sleeves slipped. Thalo never asked her to change, never told her to be less or more. He simply made space for her voice, her fears, her joy. One morning she found an old shawl of his mother's folded by the hearth, embroidered with Lakota symbols. "It's for you," he said. "If you wear it, the wind will carry your name across these hills." She wept then, not because it was beautiful, but because it was the first thing ever given to her that wasn't out of pity. That evening they sat with a visiting elder from a neighboring band. He greeted Clara in Lakota, and Thalo translated, "He says he sees in you a woman of medicine, of returning light." Clara looked down. "I've only ever brought shame." But the elder touched her cheek and said, "No. You carry storms, and storms are how rivers are reborn. That night, she dreamed of her father's face, but it no longer held power. She saw herself walking through her old town, not to beg, but to stand tall. The next day, Thalo took her to a place deep in the forest where stone and moss made a quiet circle. "This is where we say what must be let go," he explained. She knelt and pressed her palms to the earth. "I let go of believing I was ugly," she whispered, "of thinking I had to earn love by suffering first." She placed her old shoes there, shoes her father gave her before sending her away. "I'll walk forward barefoot if I must," she said. Thalo came beside her, placing an eagle feather on the stones. "I let go of silence that kept me small," he said, and they left together, lighter. Back at the cabin, she looked at the fire and said, "I think I'm not afraid of being seen anymore." He nodded. "Good. Because you were never invisible to me." That night they danced under the open sky, not with music but with movement born of belonging. No one watched, but the stars did. And Clara, who had once been given away like a curse, now moved as if her body was a gift. For Thalo, it always had been. For herself, it finally was. They married without a preacher, without witnesses, without rings, just the two of them, beneath the same cottonwood where Clara had once stumbled into his arms. Thalo traced a circle on the earth with his knife, then stepped inside and offered her his palm. "This is our ceremony," he said, "not by papers but by promise." Clara placed her hand in his, her eyes clear, her back straight. "Then let this be the last day I feel unworthy." He smiled, not the shy half-smile of a man unsure, but the full and certain joy of one who had waited all his life for this moment. She wore a simple deerskin dress, hand-stitched by his cousin's wife, and her hair was braided in 2 long ropes that swung behind her shoulders like flags of a new nation. After their vows, they returned to the cabin where a pot of stew bubbled, and a newborn lamb, gifted by a neighbor, bleated from a woven basket. Clara knelt beside it, cradling the lamb as gently as she once wished someone had cradled her. "You'll have a name," she whispered, "because I finally do." They named the lamb Mako, meaning earth. Weeks turned into seasons. Clara began teaching other girls from the band how to cook, sew, and stand tall when they were spoken down to. She was still soft, still wide-hipped, still slow to rise some mornings, but no one in the valley mistook her for fragile. Thalo built her a bench beneath the tree where they met. On it, he carved, "She was never meant to be hidden." One day, a rider from Clara's old town arrived with a message. Her father had passed. He'd left nothing but a ledger, debts, and a note that read, "Forgive me if you can." Clara burned the note without reading it twice. "I don't need to carry that man's name," she told Thalo. "I carry yours now." But Thalo shook his head gently. "No," he said. "You carry your own." And from that day forward, she did. When children asked how their love began, she didn't tell them of shame or punishment or snow. She said, "He saw me before I knew how to see myself. And when I whispered who I was, he listened." No story ever started stronger than that. And no woman, once discarded like a burden, ever stood taller than Clara did, loved not in spite of who she was, but precisely because of it. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had seen her there, would you have stepped in too? Tell us in the comments.